I think probably it's useful to give a quick overview of the first version of the study, and then there's a bit of context as to what we wanted to look at with this update. So effectively, in the first version of the study, we wanted to understand, our overarching objective was to understand why marketing investment was becoming more activation based and more short term. We've seen this shift happen over the course of the last sort of 20 years, from about 60% of investment being long-term brand type investment to just over half now being sales activation, direct response type investment. So the original study looked at 4 areas. I won't go into them in any great detail, but effectively the first was around belief in brands. Do business leaders still believe in brands and their capacity to deliver commercial returns? Secondly, who was controlling marketing investment within businesses, and particularly that brand marketing, that long-term marketing investment. Third was around knowledge and understanding. We wanted to compare the beliefs of business leaders as to how brands were built and maintained with the reality of how they're built and maintained, according to the evidence that the IPA, amongst others, have produced around that. And then finally, around creativity, we wanted to see whether there was an understanding of the link between creative excellence and commercial return. So I won't go into the findings of that. There's plenty been written about the findings of our original study, but with our research, our 2020 update, we wanted to, I suppose, reflect on on our original findings in how they may have developed in the context of what's been a very strange year. We know that the operating environment for many businesses has changed a lot since the pandemic struck earlier in the year. And I suppose what we wanted to do with this was hone in on 2 particular dimensions to that. The first was what's become, over the course of the last 12 months, a very negative macroeconomic outlook. We're seeing a sharper downturn than previously. And I suppose it's different from other downturns in that sense. But I suppose this may give a sense of how businesses respond in times of macroeconomic trouble and uncertainty, how they respond in terms of their marketing investment and behavior. So this, I think there's some learnings around the impact of the macroeconomic outlook, which probably apply beyond the situation we're in at the moment. And then the second area we honed in on is how beliefs and perceptions and the management of brands have changed in the context of the new emerging customer behavior that we're seeing. We'll talk a bit about it in more depth, but the pandemic, because of the lockdowns associated with the pandemic, customer behavior has been changed in a sort of forcibly, and some of that behavior we're now seeing stick. And it's what we've done with this study is explore how businesses have responded to that and what they believe they need to do in terms of their marketing investment in order to meet the needs of this new customer behavior. So I'm now going to hand over to Enzo, who'll tell you a little bit more about the research and then go through some of the first findings.
Great, thank you, David. And hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As David mentioned, I'm just going to take you very quickly through the methodology for this study, to give you an idea of who we captured and how we conducted the research. So the survey was sent to the FT's Global Reader Panel, who we affectionately refer to as the FT Feedback Forum. This is a group of around 15,000 FT readers who we regularly contact for research purposes. Just to give you some idea, actually, the majority of the work that we run with our panel runs in 2 areas, really. We do a lot of brand studies where we're measuring the perception of brands. And then the other side of the coin is a lot of the work that we do is around sort of brand uplift studies and ROI studies to show effectiveness of campaigns. So a lot of the work that we do with the panel is actually supporting brand. With this particular study, we sent the survey to our business decision maker cohort within the panel, which was similar to the sample that we sent the survey to last year. We received 581 respondents this time. And the survey was run only a few weeks ago in September of this year. And at the bottom of this slide here, I've just tried to highlight some broad and sort of very quick demographics as to who was measured on the study. So 54%, for instance, being C-suite executives. A third of our sample have marketing decision maker responsibility. They work in large organizations. And the regional distribution is representative of the FT's global footprint. So let's crack on. As David mentioned, we're just going to take you through some of the key highlights which we've managed to mine over the last week or so. We've come up with 8 key findings from the study, and hopefully the next 8 slides will give you a very good overview as to what the study is telling us. And obviously at the end of the presentation, we can take some questions, but also following this webinar, we'd be more than happy to kind of pick up with anyone who wants to find out more. So firstly, it's clear that business priorities have changed as a direct result of the COVID pandemic. Businesses are understandably cautious, and when asked to nominate their most and least important priorities, this data supports this notion. So what we've got on this particular slide here is on the left, we can see the areas or the priorities in which businesses are placing more importance as a direct result of the COVID pandemic, namely business resilience, the level of future cash flow, and risk reduction. And on the right, you can see the priorities which are deemed as being less important given the current situation, that being increased profitability, margin improvement, and reducing price sensitivity. And following on from the previous slide, this data shows the defensive measures businesses have taken in order to preserve their balance sheet. And what we've done here is shown 2 data points. We've shown 2019 data from the study we ran last year, as well as the most recent study in 2020. Now, if we look on the right, 2020, and also the variance, the differences between 2020 and 2019, we can see some key differences in terms of shifts of priorities. Business resilience, level of future cash flow, and risk reduction have seen the biggest year-on-year increases when looking at these variables. And what is interesting is if you look at increased profitability, which was ranked number 1 in 2019, has now dropped to 6th position and has seen a marked decline of 28% since last year. Moreover, when looking at both commercial decision-making and marketing communication decision-making, it is clear that decisions have become ever more short-term, with 40% and 36% respectively making decisions in the short term. Marketing communications decision-making in particular are likely to be considered more so in the short term rather than the long term. In fact, 4 times as much, according to our data. And uncertainty is quite clear. Over half of respondents told us that their business is continually evaluating options and releasing funds when the time is right. This is supported by this comment from one of our respondents, and we had a whole selection of comments from our readers, but this one here kind of resonated quite strongly with this data point. I'm just going to read it out for you quickly. This is one area we have got right. We are continuing to invest in communications and marketing to keep us well positioned in the international marketplace. It shows that there is an appetite to spend, but only when the time is right. And finally, in my section, before I hand back over to David, clearly some sectors are showing a greater appetite to spend than others. Respondents who tend to agree with the statement, we are applying learning from other downturns and maintaining marketing expenditure to ensure we emerge healthier than our competitors, these are more likely to work in the IT, manufacturing, engineering and industrial, and professional services sectors, as opposed to some of the other sectors listed here and above the average. So that's it from me for now. I'm just going to hand back over to David, who will take you through the remaining slides in our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Enzo. That's great. So to pick up here, I'm going to talk through this slide, point 6, is one of the key findings of the study. I think the first thing to say here is that 61% statistic is really heartening. This is 61% of respondents who tell us that they're still committed to investing in their brand as before. And these are very senior leaders in large global businesses. In addition to that 61%, there's actually 14% who responded to say that whilst before the pandemic, they didn't feel that brand was a priority for investment for their business, it now is. So really that number's 3/4 of respondents say that brand investment is now a priority for their business, and spending money to generate brand strength is a priority. However, there's an interesting divergence here between the perceptions of marketers and the perceptions of non-marketers when we drill down and actually ask about the financial plans and the marketing investment plans within their businesses. Marketers are overwhelmingly more optimistic, and that's what these statements here these show. So there's no key on this, but this is showing the divergence between non-marketers and marketers for agreement to these statements. So you can see the top one is this year's budgets were cut significantly early in the year, but our planning for 2021 is more positive. Marketers are 19% more likely to agree with that statement. They're 42% more likely to agree with the statement that the position has changed and brand investment is now a priority. So they're thinking that even more than the rest of business discipline, leaders of business disciplines are thinking that. And conversely, they're far less likely to think that any cuts are not going to be reassessed until next year. So what we're seeing here is a real difference between what marketers believe the financial planning looks like and what the rest of the business believes the financial planning looks like. And given our audience over-indexes in board level executives and particularly in the finance discipline, I think that what this suggests to me is that there's a divide. The marketers aren't necessarily appraised of the financial decision making and those sort of top table decisions that are being made about investment in the business. And that may be because they don't have a seat at the board table. It may be that they're just not party to those conversations. And I think this talks to some of the points that have already been discussed as within EffWorks. Chris Pitt was talking about this, for instance, and he's someone who's one of the rare marketers who's made that transition from the CMO role into a CEO role. But I think this sort of shines a light on the distance between those responsible for marketing and those very senior people responsible for marketing and those responsible for financial planning. And I think one of the calls to action for this is probably, and it was also a call to action for the discipline and for the profession from the last study, is that we need to try and bridge that gap. And it's the IPA have been doing fantastic work in this area, and we're committed to supporting and to working to do that as well. So the next two slides, we drilled down into how these business leaders perceive their customers to be discovering and purchasing their products in the context of the events of the last year. This slide shows data which effectively validated a view that we had, and it wasn't surprising to us, and that's that they perceived online discovery, online channels to be ever more important for product discovery and for product purchase. I would probably say that I wasn't expecting that degree of divergence. So, 50% net dramatic or slight change up is far more, given the breadth of sectors that we deal with. So this is clearly a really significant thing that businesses are giving a lot of thought to. So in the next slide, we asked our business leaders whether they believed that brand strength was more or less important for online when compared to offline discovery and purchase processes. So, and you can see here the data, and this was a surprise to me, and in that they believe that actually having a strong brand is even more important if you're going to win in an increasingly online marketplace than offline. So this is a really heartening point for the marketing industry as consumers move online in order to find products and in order to purchase products. Business leaders believe brands are even more important in that context. So I suppose the challenge will be avoiding some of the temptations of direct response digital campaigns and maintaining an appropriate balance between activation and brand investment, when if the purchase is online, the sales activation activity is going to be so trackable, and that's obviously going to pose a challenge for us. But the belief is there. Senior leaders in these businesses believe that when you're buying a product online, or when your customers are finding and buying products online, it's even more important to have a strong brand, which is, I think, fantastic news for us as an industry and for the creative industry as well, because it's great creative that generates brand strength that in turn will deliver commercial performance. So just to wrap up before we go to some questions, it's quite hard to summarize this because there's a lot of nuance in the data. I mean, I would say broadly that the overall pattern we're seeing is mirrors the first study. There's a strong belief in the value of brand. There's, as I just said, a strong belief in the value of brand, even in the context of increasing the online discovery and purchase processes. But there are clearly significant cyclical headwinds for releasing brand money for brand investment, on top of the structural headwinds that we uncovered in the first study. Budget management is, there's macroeconomic uncertainty. There's a huge amount of uncertainty in the market. Budget management is becoming short-term. Commercial decision-making is becoming more short-term. Marketing communications decision-making is consequently becoming more short-term as well. And that's going to have an impact. But it feels like the belief is there, and the sort of the underlying perspectives are in there in order to release that funds when the world looks a bit better. So this is the first time we presented this. I hope, and the first time anyone's seen these findings, I hope you find them interesting, and I look forward to Enzo and I being able to answer some questions. Okay, so I've got one in here. And I think they pop up, but if not, I'll read it out. So, do you think we should be focusing more of the industry sell on brand and long term on its ability to deliver resilience and cash flow, given the greater focus of this? That's certainly an interesting one. So, Enzo, how do you want to approach this? There's definitely a point in here about business priorities and the relationship between business priorities and where brands are seen to deliver a return.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think understandably, I think a lot of businesses have gone into their bunkers in terms of being in defensive mode. And I think that's something that came out quite strongly in the study, but perhaps not surprising, right? We're in uncertain times, and while you can plan and look at previous downturns, this is a downturn like no other. But that said, I think the optimism, or at least the positive in the long term, is the point you made towards the end of your section, David, which is around the fact that the belief in brands is still there, even more so online. So as consumer trends change, etc., and increasingly online, I think there is a positive story there for the long term. So while we're currently in the short term, I think that what rings true, and actually rung true in the previous study that we did, was the belief in brand, which is something I think we should take away as being a positive from this study and the previous study.
Absolutely. There's a really interesting, thanks, Enzo. There's a really interesting one that's just come in here, and that's, should we believe the panel's claim about their commitment to brand? And I think this is fascinating because consistently we've seen, over the 2 years we've now done this, we've seen the respondents. So it comes through really strongly that they believe that brands are hugely powerful commercial devices and commercial mechanisms, and yet it hasn't changed what's happening to marketing investment. So should we believe in the panel's claim to their commitment to brand, and how do we square the disconnect between I suppose what they're saying and the actions that we're seeing in terms of marketing investment? What's your thoughts on that one, Enzo?
Well, I think certainly. I mean, I think apologies. The joys of working from home. My alarm's going off. I do think that the panel, and as you alluded to, the seniority and the caliber of respondents that responded to our study. The fact that they value brand is important. I mean, obviously, the original study was called the board brand rift because there clearly was a divergence between what marketing decision makers, how they saw the future in the business compared to what the board were thinking. The board were involved in that decision making process, but actually, did they really understand what was their knowledge of actually how to build a brand? I mean, purely from a research point of view, what I'm seeing, the trend is ever increasing. Particularly as we head into Q4 now, with a lot of our advertising partners, measuring the success of campaigns on on a campaign by campaign basis has become a prerequisite now rather than a nice to have. We're doing multiple studies as a team in terms of showing efficacy and the value of brand, both through tactical campaign effectiveness studies, but also some of the brand work that we do is very longitudinal. So what we try and do as a team is kind of, I guess, make the case for and support the notion of the importance of brand. So, and that, as I said, that's where the majority of investment, and certainly in my budget, is going in terms of research, the work that we run through the team.
And yeah, I entirely agree with that. And there's probably another point in here, which is that one of the things that came through, not so much in this study, but in the last one, was that brand metrics were generally not reviewed at kind of board level, and that's the level at which this survey's, it's 50% C-level executives. So whilst in theory they believe in stuff, perhaps, or indeed it appears that they're not tracking it, they're not having a conversation about brand strength, and therefore they're probably not directing investment in that way. And as we know from the last study, the temptation for marketers is always has been and always will be to some degree to follow the trackable activity where you can pin a direct return on investment. So there's a kind of structural issue and a governance issue there as well, I'd say.
Yeah, particularly as the market is being inundated with metrics, and everything is measurable now, particularly on the online space. So actually cutting through and actually delivering that piece of insight that's actionable, that actually helps brands build their brand and actually understand which levers to pull. Is something which certainly I and my team and the wider business have seen in terms of working with us as a partner, really, in not just leveraging our own first-party data, for instance, through through our registration process to understand how consumers are behaving and looking at trends, but also to kind of look at normative data, look at and actually make it more actionable, as I said, because I think otherwise they're just completely bombarded with different metrics, and that's probably why I think there's a slight sort of confusion there at the board level. But I guess that's the job of the marketer to kind of prove that.
Yeah, making that link is going to be central to this, to this being this changing. And I know some of the work we're doing around brand effectiveness studies is hopefully trying to do that, to make that link between direct commercial performance and brand strength. I think unfortunately we've run out of time here, but that we really enjoyed talking to you, and we hope you find the study interesting. We'll publish it on the EffWorks website, so you can download it there, or you can connect with Enzo and myself on LinkedIn. Lovely to talk to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.